Welcome to the first episode of My Relationship Matters. Now, in this episode, we will talk about sending money to our loved ones in the Philippines, which may have already been cause of conflicts between you and your spouse. Now, I know this is a tricky and sticky subject to many of us, even to those who are both Filipinos. Much worse to those who are married to Westerners who don't understand why we send money to our families back home. Now, to send once or twice or in an emergency situation is fine to them or to some spouses, but to send money to our loved ones back home on a monthly, regular basis can be unacceptable, especially if you did not talk about this issue before you get married, and especially if you don't have the money to send. Now, money is always a sensitive topic in marriage, and no wonder many couples avoid talking about this. According to a Citibank survey, 57% of divorced couples cited money problems as the primary reasons for the demise of the marriage. Now, this issue of money becomes more complicated to Filipinos who are married to Westerners, especially those who send money back home. Now, the question is, why do Filipinos send money to our loved ones back home in the Philippines? Well, for obvious reasons that in the Philippines, money is hard to come by, and there's a lot of our relatives who are going through some tough times in the Philippines. But aside from that, here's the underlying cultural reasons. There are actually three that I want to share to you. First, yung utang na loob. Okay? We send money because out of utang na loob, or being grateful. Filipinos have a deep sense of gratitude to their parents for birthing them, raising them, and sending them to school. And the least that you want to hear from your parents back home is, wala kang utang na loob. You are an ingrate. Now, sending money and balikbayan boxes is a way to show how grateful you are to them. The second after utang na loob is, obligasyon mo kasi nasa abroad ka. And that would make you feel obligated because you are living here and not there. Now, even though it is not actually your obligation to send your hard-earned money here to your families and loved ones back home, because of course your primary responsibility and obligation is your spouse and children and the bills that you need to pay. However, the economic situation of your families back home in the Philippines make you feel guilty, or they makes you feel guilty if you don't help them financially. It is actually a sad reality that some of the relatives back home would come to a point of manipulating their relatives here to give them an obligation to feed them, to pay their rents and utilities, to buy them cell phones, and to send their relatives to school. So first one, utang na loob. Second one, obligasyon mo kasi nasa abroad ka. The third one is, sabi kasi ng Diyos. God told us so. Now, part of the Filipino culture is our fear of God. There are several scriptures that tell us to financially help our parents, especially if they are no longer employed or can no longer be employed or are financially struggling. Jesus talks about that in Mark chapter 7 verses 11 to 13. Now, if they are a widow and have no source of income, Paul also talks about that in 1 Timothy chapter 5 verse 4. Now, even to our relatives who are really in deep financial hole, we who are living a better life should send at least a little help to them. Paul talks about that in 1 Timothy chapter 5 verse 8. Now, the help towards your unemployed or unemployable parent should be, I could say this, that you should do it on a regular basis, but not on your relatives. Why? Well, because if you send money on a regular basis to your relatives who are still able to work, you are not actually helping them to succeed in life, but you are helping them to fail and be dependent on you. Unfortunately, there are some Filipino parents who imposes this notion to their children. Inalagaan kita para alagaan mo ko pagtanda ko. I took care of you so you can take care of me when I grow old. Now, I want to be honest with you. Every time I hear this, I feel sad. You know why? Because you did not get yourself pregnant, or you did not impregnate somebody and raise that child to be your insurance when you grow old. Okay? Now, why does your Westerner spouse don't get it? Well, first, Westerners are taught to be independent at a very young age. And part of that training is they know that it is not their responsibility to help their parents financially even when they grow old. What they earn is theirs. And Western parents, they don't want anything to do with their children's money. They want nothing to do with their children's income. And the second reason is this: your Westerner spouse is not an anti-family. In fact, most, if not all of them, are actually family-centered. But their family is just around their immediate family members. The focus of their financial concern is just you and your children and the bills that you need to pay. Since they don't concern themselves with helping their parents financially unless when they are in a dire financial situation, they also don't concern themselves with helping your parents back home or your loved ones back home because they are not their parents. They are not their loved ones. Now, here's the question. How are we going to avoid this conflict? Well, first, sit down and talk about this with your spouse. Let your spouse understand where you are coming from. And also, understand where your spouse is coming from. It would have been better to talk about this while you are still dating, but if you are already married and this is a recurring issue, sit down and talk about it and listen to how your spouse feels about it. Now, when you talk, when you listen, you don't listen to argue. You listen to understand. Don't be afraid to make a compromise. If, let's say, $200 a month is tough on your budget, maybe you can compromise to how about $150 a month or $100 a month. Now, if your spouse is not agreeable to send your loved ones money from your spouse's salary, which is very much understandable because he is not their responsibility, then maybe you can save from your own savings or from your own income as long as it is not going to affect your immediate family's budget. Second, now I know this might sound too blunt, but your family in the Philippines is not your primary responsibility. Yes, your poor, unemployable parents might be your and your siblings' responsibilities, but they are not your primary responsibility. So tactfully but respectfully explain to your family back home that your primary responsibility is your family here. Explain to them as well your financial situation here in your adopted country. Yes, it is true that you are earning dollars, but you are also paying everything in dollars. And you have bills, mortgage, rent, car, insurance, and taxes to pay. And you need to feed your family here as well. Now, the third thing that you can do is dictate the terms and not them. Don't allow your family back in the Philippines to dictate how much and how often you should send them money. Now, this is true even to your parents. Again, stay on what you and your spouse agreed on based on your budget and financial health. Don't even allow them to manipulate you into sending them the latest iPhone or expensive purses or designer clothes and shoes, especially if it would require you to use your credit card to purchase them. It is not need. It is not a need and they can live without it. Remember, it's not them who is going to pay your credit cards later on, including the interest, but you. The rule of thumb is if you cannot afford to buy yourself, your children, and your spouse the items that your family in the Philippines are asking you don't buy it. Another rule of thumb is this: don't sink yourself into debt just to make your loved ones in the Philippines happy. Kalokohan yan. That is foolishness. Now, hard truth about utang na loob is this: you cannot really pay it off however you wanted to. Hindi mo mababayaran ang utang na loob hanggang mamatay ka. Though it is a good Filipino value, but it can also be enslaving. It can make you a slave when abused. The bottom line is this: it is a noble act to help our families, our parents, our loved ones back home. But it should not cost your marriage and your mortgage here at home. And I hope you learned something, you pick up something from what we talked about in this first episode. My Relationship Matter is a ministry of the International Bible Christian Fellowship in Linwood, Washington, and of the Filipino American Church in Marysville, Washington. Please like, subscribe, and click the bell icon to get notified for the next episode. Also, feel free to share this to others who can relate to the issue, even to your families in the Philippines, so they can understand your situation here. Tag them, if you will. Now, if you have questions, feel free to ask in the comment section below. God bless you and God bless us all.